Great. Well, thanks for the time today. As mentioned, my name is Joe. I'm from Amplitude. I'm a solution consultant there. And what we're going to do today is walk through a bit of a live demo, really, go into the platform, understand exactly how within Amplitude ecosystem you can deliver great product experiences, but from a cross-functional perspective. In terms of the agenda on what we want to cover, we've only got 45 minutes, so it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to introduce you to the system I'm going to be using today, our digital optimization system. And then we'll spend the majority of the time going into actually a live demo of the platform, covering a variety of different use cases. And then, time permitting, we can open it up for some Q&A. And obviously, if that overruns, then feel free to come and grab me out there, and we can discuss in more detail. So to start with, I think to introduce the Amplitude digital optimization system, there's three key pillars that we deliver on to help companies drive better product experiences. The first is around the core analytics function, which is understanding user behaviors, how users are interacting with your product, and what they're doing with them within the product that actually makes that insight useful for you to be able to drive user experiences for other users. The next pillar is around then prediction, is once we have that understanding of user behavior, how can we then use user behavior, use the analytics to actually run predictive models around prediction, say propensity prediction, or understand recommendation models as to how users, what content should you be showing a user within your product. The third is then once you've made that prediction, is being able to then deliver the experience. How can you then actually adapt the user experience, but do it in a way that you can then prove the value of what you're doing? So rather than just rolling out new experiences to end users, we want to be able to validate within the data that new experience is actually delivering the end goal. Not only actually just delivering that end goal, but being able to understand any impact on any longer term KPIs that you might have as a business. Because whilst you roll out new experiments or new testing for certain use cases, you need to have the wider holistic visibility on the user journey to be able to understand if that test might be impacting other key KPIs for the company. Now, to introduce you to a couple of the products that we'll be going through today, and then we'll jump into the demo platform. The first is around Amplitude Analytics. Now, I think it's important to call out that all three of these products that we'll be touching on sit on a common data layer. So there's a core data management system, which as you ingest data from multiple sources, we can consolidate that together. And sitting on top of that is what we call our behavioral graph, which then takes user identity from multiple different platforms and stitches that user behavior together, so that you can get a really true holistic view of how users are interacting with your product across multiple devices and platforms. Now, Amplitude Analytics is the core component for actually understanding that user behavior. It's that first pillar that we discussed of understanding how users are interacting with your product. The next pillar is around Amplitude Recommend, which is around running predictive models on that data. So once you've defined a certain interesting cohort, potentially you might want to push that out for marketing use cases, or you might want to take that cohort and run predictive algorithms against that. That's what we would do within Amplitude Recommend. And then finally, Amplitude Experiment is the ability to then actually run feature flagging or A/B testing directly within the platform, but based on that behavioral data. So that's not an isolated component to actually run feature flagging as you're delivering new components to your product. It's based on the behavioral data that we would have captured within the data management platform beneath. Okay, so we're going to jump into the demo, and for this demo, I'm going to be talking about a fictitious product called AmpliFit, a fitness product where users can join fitness classes online. And I'll be adopting the role of John, who's a product manager at AmpliFit. And his goal really is to truly understand user behavior, but start to understand how he can help the team drive customer value and ultimately help them build a better product. Okay, so hopefully you can, is that visible to anyone? Do I need to zoom in a bit? Yeah. Is that a bit better? Go back one. So when you initially come into Amplitude, you first arrive at what we call team spaces. Now, the reason I wanted to just quickly touch on this was this is an important component of making sure that cross-functional teams can adopt one core platform. So within team spaces, you can essentially come into, in my role as John, I'd be working within my product management team space, and I can then collaborate with various users across the company on the insights that I'm looking to drive. Now, within this example, we're looking at Amplifit as a business, and within Amplifit during the pandemic, we took a lot of our fitness classes online. Now, we saw a lot of bookings coming through, but what we wanted to do is move over to a subscription-based model. So in doing that, we've recently released the capability to run a subscription-based model, but we want to start to understand how that is performing for us. So there's some important capabilities that we have then to be able to do that. First off, here I have a top-line dashboard. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with dashboarding capability. And here what we can see is that we have our class purchases versus our subscription purchases. Now, we know this is a new capability that we're delivering. We're trying to drive more subscription purchases. And what we can see actually is that the subscriber growth seems to be growing over time, which is great to see. There's some anomalies that have been detected which I could dig into within the platform to help uncover, well, what is driving that uptick in subscription growth. But importantly, this is a really key valuable metric for us, is to understand that actually the lifetime value that we can capture within Amplitude is significantly higher. So here we're looking at the average revenue per paying user and comparing that between class purchases and subscription purchases. So it's immediate validation that the lifetime value of users within our subscription model is more beneficial to us as a business. So we want to start to try and drive this user adoption on subscription purchases. Now, to do so, what I might want to look into is this subscription conversion. And I'm going to then deep dive into one of our analyses to actually dig into this conversion funnel in a bit more detail. So here I'm looking at my conversion funnel, and I can see this is users that have started a trial and ultimately users that then went through to purchase subscription. Now, I may have some of my own thoughts around why that might be happening. First off, I might want to start to question some of this data. Users have started the trial, but I might be interested in, well, actually, do users actually go on to complete the trial? By pulling in that user event, I can then filter down my funnel, and then I can start to understand, well, actually, there seems to be a significant drop-off between users that start the trial and complete the trial. So there's a couple of things I can use Amplitude to start to dig into the why. Why am I seeing this user behavior? So first off, I can see that there's, between purchase subscription and complete trial, we see there's a 68% conversion in steps from completing the trial to purchasing the subscription. I may want to dig into that in a bit more detail. So what I can do here is go into what we call user journeys. Now, user journeys is going to show me, well, what are the happy paths or the key drop-off paths from any point A to any point B within the platform? Now, my point A and point B in this scenario is users that have completed the trial, and my point B is users that go on to then purchase my subscription. Now, this is now giving me a cross-session and cross-platform view. So if I'm using multiple devices, that would be captured within a view like this. And I can start to see the typical user behaviors that drop out of my funnel. So here I can see the top user behavior is there's 21% of users that end their session. They've completed the trial and they've dropped off. There's not really much more we can do about that, apart from potentially we might want to go and re-engage them with some marketing content, which I'll come on to. What we can also see here, though, is all of these top paths that we're seeing, every one of them starts with the user ending the session. Now, that doesn't seem ideal to me in terms of a user behavior. When I complete the trial, why am I ending the session? And all four of these user paths, there's a significant percentage here, so roughly around 10% of users, maybe even more. All of those users are ending their session, but they're then coming back. So we need to look into this. So this immediately starts to give me one question to explore. So I'm going to save this chart. Just going to call it Journey Demo for an example, and I'm going to add that to my team space. Now, what I can also do here is then I want to then comment here. I could integrate this directly with Slack if we use that as a business, so I could have a Slack channel that I could then ping users directly through Slack. or I can do it through the platform. So that then sends a notification to my fictitious user, who's going to then actually be able to look into, well, why is it that users seem to drop off in that funnel? Why do they essentially end their session and then come back? So that's something that we need to explore. Now, if I come back to my original funnel, what I'm also interested in is this key drop-off between users that have started the trial and ultimately those users that have completed the trial. So there's a couple of things I can do here. I'm really interested in this data point, and everything that we have within Amplitude is always interactive, so I don't need to be a technical end user to start to ask these questions. Here, what I'm going to do is what we call explore conversion drivers. Now, this is now looking at all of the correlated events that are correlated with the specific two events I'm looking at. So users that started the trial and try to get through to completing the trial, what are the correlated events for users that, in this instance, that dropped out of that funnel? Here, obviously, as we've already seen, we can see a number of users end their session, but what we can see here is there's quite a high percentage of users that are searching for classes. So this then gets me thinking as to, well, why is that correlated with users dropping off? Maybe they're not finding what they're looking for. They're starting the trial. There's a high correlation with users that are searching for classes, and that's correlated with users that drop out of my funnel. Maybe we are sending users through to our product from certain marketing campaigns, which aren't then relevant to what we actually have available in terms of fitness campaign or fitness capabilities. So I might want to explore this even further by the promo code that's applied as they then join our platform. Here, that doesn't give me much insight in terms of one key promo code. It doesn't look like any specific promo code is driving this user behavior. So I might then start to take another tack. So what I'm going to do is instead of actually looking at conversion drivers, I'm going to build a cohort of this user, of all these users. Now, this cohort is going to essentially allow me to do a few different things. First off, I want to then leverage this cohort for marketing use cases. I know there's a group of users that have started the trial. They haven't completed the trial. I could then go and remarket these users using our Recommend product. What I also want to do is try to use Recommend to build predictive model to say, well, actually, if they're not finding the classes they're looking for, maybe I can use algorithms behind the scenes to expose the content that I think is most relevant to that end user, to try and make sure that we're retaining these customers that have started their trial. So I'll save this cohort. The description auto-populates, but I think really importantly to note that the original chart will always then remain within the description, so anyone else looking to use this cohort can understand how it's been built. And I will ultimately then save that cohort. Now, if I come into this cohort, what I can now see is that I've captured 41,000 users who have started the trial but didn't complete the trial. So there's a couple of things that I want to then do for these specific users. By clicking on synchronization, what I'm going to do is try to then sync this cohort out to a different destination from a marketing perspective. So here I can take this cohort of users. I might want to pass that out to marketing platforms such as Facebook or in-app messaging platforms who can deliver either email, push notifications, to actually try to encourage that user to convert on their trial. Actually, if I click into manage the destinations, there's a number of different destinations that I can then add to my account, whether this be for taking data and passing it out to testing platforms or to social platforms or one-to-one messaging platforms. There's a range of different integrations that we have to serve different purposes on why you might want to leverage that cohort. So that's the first step that we can do in terms of trying to then re-engage those users. Now, within Recommend, what we then have the ability to do is actually then run predictive capabilities. So in the bottom left, we see that we have predictions. Here I can then create predictive models. So predict users within that audience. Say I don't want to target the full audience. Let's say it was a large size of 200,000 users or something. I don't want to target all of those users, maybe I want to try and predict which of those are likely to purchase. So base that model on propensity to purchase. And then I might want to say, take the top 10 percentile, or so the 90th plus percentile of users likely to purchase, and I can do that directly by using predictions. In this demo, what we're going to do instead is actually look towards our recommendations model and say, well, how can I then expose the content that we think is most likely or most relevant to the end user to try and stop them dropping off the platform because they were struggling to find what they were looking for. So to do that, what I can do is jump into recommendations. And within the platform, I can then create my recommendations here. So first off, I want to specify what the desired outcome is. What am I looking to drive with this recommendation? So ultimately, my end goal, as we've discussed before, I'm trying to drive subscription revenue. So I want to make sure that my recommendation is driving towards that key metric. Next, I then need to specify, well, what's the items that I want to expose to the end user? Within their experience, they're looking for classes, so I want to actually expose the relevant classes to those within the product. So I can find an event which has then data captured within Amplitude. So I'm going to users that have added their class, and I'm going to select the class ID. Now this then lists out all of the classes that we have available, the data behind them from a 30-day uniques perspective, and I can then use that as my catalog that I want to then run data modeling behind to understand, well, which classes are relevant to which user groups. I would simply then go and save this model, and that model will then go and build behind the scenes. Now, to come back to one that's been pre-built, here I can then see an overview of the model and see the most likely item per rank, but it's important to bear in mind that this ranking order is going to be different for every single individual, because they've gone through that model and it's based on the underlying data attributes about me as an end user compared to how all other users use the platform. And what I can then see is actually understand, well, what's the key lift of this model? So the actual conversion rate we're seeing from our recommendation model is close to 3%, whereas the control conversion rate by not showing this recommendation is just over 2%. So we're seeing a significant uplift in terms of the conversion rate on users that we're exposing to recommendations versus not. And there's a few things I can do. So this is actually linking us into the analytics part of the platform, so I can then start to analyze the data or understand if there are anomalies in my data and start to question those. But ultimately, I can also jump back into analytics if I want to explore that even further. All of these are directly tied together from a platform perspective, so all of that filters down for me to be able to analyze user behavior at the end of the day. So I can now come down into analytics, and I can now specify my recommendation event and then look to explore that further across maybe different types of analysis. Okay, so that's one stage of the journey. Now, what I want to then do is not only build my recommendation model and just roll that out, I want to have control over how I'm rolling that out. So I may not want to roll this recommendation model out to my whole audience. I want to have more control in how I'm doing it. And this is where we can use experiment to start to say, well, actually, I want to first off test whether this is driving any statistical significance, but also control, actually, maybe I only want to roll this out to 10% of my user base or to 20% and validate there's no issues with it before I roll that out to the whole audience. So within experiment, what I'll come down to is our experiments that we have running, and I'm going to jump into our recommendation experiment. So within Amplitude, what we can do is then define an experiment, essentially either an A/B test, or we can just use this for core feature flagging capability. But first off, what I want to do is set the context around why I'm running the experiment. If you ever try to drive any experiment programs within a company, you always need to drive it with data. What's the hypothesis why am I doing this experiment in the first place? Now, this can link me back into analytics to what we call notebooks. Now, notebooks, as we saw before when I was looking at a dashboard, that's simply just a top-line view of key KPIs. I'm looking at certain charts. But what the problem with that is I always leave it up to the end user to make their own interpretations as to what that data really means. What we can do within a notebook is actually capture these core charts and provide them in this document format where I can then explain my thought process as how I came to a certain hypothesis. I can have the links directly to these charts, so these are live charts, and in this instance, we're defining a problem statement that actually there's the users that didn't convert, which we already know, and the user that's then gone and built this experiment for us is also giving us context that they've found another key attribute, another key data point which is relevant to this experience, is that they found that users that actually take more than 5 classes retain at much higher rates. So they want to tie that together with our testing to actually only run this test out for users who have taken less than 5 classes. Now, me as an end user, I might not have been responsible for running this analysis, but I can then interpret the context of it because the data is there readily available for me within the notebook, which is ultimately linked back to my experiment. Now, within my experiment, what I want to do is then set up the success metrics. What am I looking to target the experiment based on? I can use a primary and secondary metric, and then simply set up my variance. Now, this is where the feature flagging capability comes in within Amplitude, where essentially we can inform the product whether to turn on or turn off different capabilities or different features based on the decision that Amplitude makes. So that decision could be based on whether I'm a member of that user cohort, users that have taken less than 5 classes. Now, importantly, we then come down to the allocation. So here is where I'm defining which users should receive the experience. So you can see here, I'm then applying this to a cohort, just like the one that we built earlier, but this one's slightly different, is users that have taken less than 5 classes as my cohort. And within that cohort, I'm only then applying it to 10% of that user group to first off validate if my hypothesis is backed up by data. And each of those are going to receive 5% each of the control experience and the test experience. And ultimately, once I've defined that, I can then come down and analyze the significance. Now, I've only just launched this, so this is going to tell me that the test needs more data to be conclusive. And over time, it uses a sequential testing algorithm behind the scenes to actually understand, well, which experience is driving statistical significance. And as soon as we can hit that significance, we can then stop the test and then roll that feature out more widespread across that user group. Okay. So what I wanted to then do was try to bring this to life a little bit in more of a live example of some of those things. So what I'm going to bring up is my very basic website, but this is an example of what the AmpliFit product looks like. And I'm going to try and then illustrate how, with this data set, how I can then actually capture user behavior within analytics, how we can then drive experimentation, and ultimately how we could drive a recommendation on a live site, hopefully. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my site, and I need to log in as my end user. So I'm going to set my user ID. I'm going to call it joe.wilsondemo at ampli, can't spell. I'm just going to copy that. So I've logged in with my fictitious login to my AmpliFit product. Now, what I want to show you is, first off, that data can then be captured within our product here. So if I look for joe.wilson, did I spell it correctly? There we go. So this is the account that I just set up. So joe.wilsondemo@amplifit.com. And we can see this user has clicked a button and ultimately visited the landing page. There's a lot of data we then capture behind the scenes in terms of the actual core events as I'm interacting with the product, but also attributes may be relevant to me, what country I'm in, what device I'm on. We can use that all for product analytics use cases. Now, what I want to do is expose this user to my experiment. So I'm going to force this user into a specific experiment for demo purposes. So I'm going to come into experiment, and there's an experiment that we're running on that website, which is called our AmpliFit website experiment. Very similar in terms of definition of what we just defined before. And so what we're doing here is trying to have our control, which is users seeing the helping people build better lifestyles, which essentially is the experience that I'm already seeing. My test experiment, my test experience is ultimately trying to change that. And we're trying to drive a hypothesis that maybe we can encourage these users to invite friends to their next workout class, because we as a product team have determined that that's driving value for us. So here within the platform, what I'm going to do is just force this user into my experiment. So we can see here I'm actually allocating this to individual users. This would be used for more of a QA perspective within the product rather than actually what you do in a live scenario. In a live scenario, what you would do is either use cohorting or you use the core feature flagging capability. Now, if I save that experiment, I've now run that out. And ultimately, all things being well, I can then receive a different experience for this end user. Because what's happened behind the scenes is that Amplitude is calling out to Experiment to say which experience should this user receive. Experiment is responding back with the flag that should be exposed to that user. And based on the targeting that I've defined within Experiment, I can now receive this new experience, which is encouraging me to invite friends to my next workout class. Now, what I can then do is also explore classes. And here in exploring classes, as part of that experiment, I can enable then recommendations to roll out for the users, again, as I've defined them to roll out. I could choose to roll this out globally from all of my audience, or I could choose to refine that for, say, 10% of my audience. Now, these recommendations, as we're seeing them, are being driven by the recommendation engine within Amplitude Recommend. We're simply using Experiment to expose that to the end user. So we can see the say, Body Melt as being the top one, Anchor Your Meditation as being the third experience. That's actually all referenced within my profile. So if I go back to this end user's profile, what I can see is that this recommendation event has occurred, and all of those attributes are being stored back against my profile. So we can see here the recommended items. Here is now then a list of those recommended items that have been exposed to me. So we can see Body Melt was the first one, Anchor Your Meditation as the third recommendation. So in a nutshell, what we've done is try to show how you can take the analytics of understanding user behavior. You can run predictive models. We took an example of running a recommendation, but actually there's other ways you can do that in terms of actually predicting propensity to perform a certain action. And then we've defined how we want to expose that to the end user using the Experiment platform. So that's using feature flagging, but based on behavioral cohort data. All of that ultimately gets captured back within the data management capability of Amplitude, which then can allow you to analyze the impacts of those experiments moving forward. Okay, so finally what I'm going to do is just come back. Oh, not share, sorry. Just to come back to those three core pillars to help explain what the Amplitude system is doing, what we call our digital optimization system. It's those three core pillars that I've just tried to demo that in that short time frame. The first is around understanding user behavior. That's really the core fundamental of what Amplitude Analytics is designed to do. We touched on only really the surface of how we can do that from understanding user behaviors, but there's a lot that we can achieve within the system to allow Amplitude to ask questions and answer questions for us. So I don't need to be a technical analyst. I don't need to be very tech savvy to be able to actually answer that question. Therefore, I don't need to rely on a central analyst team to then deliver these insights for me. It's very much a self-serve product, which for the customers we work with is then adopted across multiple functions, whether it might be a customer success team, a marketing team, a product team, all using the same data at its core to then drive the business moving forward. On top of that data and insight, we then look to run predictions through Amplitude Recommend. And actually within the Recommend product, there were two use cases that we were delivering on. The first was actually leveraging the cohort to pass that out for marketing use cases. So we've identified some behavior in the product. We then passed that cohort out to a marketing tool to actually try to encourage those users back to convert on the trial. What we also then did was actually then run a recommendations model as to how we could then expose better classes within the product so that we can actually retain those users that have already started our trial. And then finally, we needed to then test and validate our hypothesis. Whilst our hypothesis initially was backed in data, we wanted to test that to make sure it was significant. And so we used Amplitude Experiment to do that, to actually expose that experience to the end user in a controlled way and ensure that actually what we're driving towards is backed up in data, which then we can prove to the business that the value that we've ultimately driven, and then improve the bottom line for the business. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the Amplitude platform. I think with the time remaining, what I was hoping to do was then just open it up for any Q&A. And obviously, if we overrun here or if there aren't questions, then feel free to come and grab me outside. Our booth's just outside by the bar, conveniently. So if anyone has any questions, then please let me know.
Thank you, Joe. We've got a question on Slido. Do you sell to B2B customers, and what are some analytics examples that they use the tool for?
We do. So in the analysis that I was showing you earlier, everything was defined at a user level. So I was analyzing user behaviors, but what we can do is actually have what we call accounts. So we have an account view, i.e. a company-wide view of user behavior. So essentially all of those users within a certain company can roll up to another level of identity within Amplitude, which is the account level. So you can then report on, say, how many companies that I'm working with are performing a certain action. Or within the example of the funnel, how many companies started the trial but didn't convert on my trial. So yeah, absolutely, we cover B2B use cases. It's very common for us to do that, and yeah, happy to talk you through the different levels of identity and how we manage that.
Thank you. Next question. How does the implementation work?
So yeah, I mean, how detailed do you want to get into? This might be one to go into more detail outside, but ultimately we can implement in a variety of different ways. We can track data client-side through client-side SDKs. We can track data server-side if you want to track using the APIs on the server. We can track data actually through more kind of batch file ingestion. If you've already got your own event pipeline, some of our customers may already be storing event pipeline data within their data warehouse. We can simply upload that data into Amplitude to then allow you to self-serve on the analytics there. There's a range of different ways we could approach implementation. But yeah, I'm imagining this number of people won't want to get into the technical specifics. So whoever had that question, we can definitely go into that in more detail for your specific scenario.
That's fine, thank you. Is there any question from the audience? Then I'm gonna keep asking questions. How long does the onboarding take? Because, it's quite comprehensive product. So how long does it take for a customer to get used to all those functions?
So typically what we see is that the core starting point or phase one of the approach is to actually get the data in line. And that's using the analytics solution. And then you can, obviously, if there's interest within the business, then expand out to the other capabilities that we saw. The onboarding process can really range. I would say as an average, probably roughly around 60 days, but it can be much quicker. It can be much longer. Very much it's something that we would work with you on, with our customer success teams, which support you post-implementation, but also our professional services team that support you during implementation. So it's how long is a piece of string type of answer, really, in that there are some companies who've done it very quickly within a month, and or even less than that, actually, but there are some other companies that have taken longer. We'd have a discussion with you around what your data currently looks like, how you want to implement, what data taxonomy works for you as a business as well, because it's important to know that there's a key element around taxonomy and data management within the platform. We want to make sure that the data is usable for all the end users, because if you don't drive a good data management structure within the platform, what typically starts to happen is user adoption starts to drop because users start to not trust the data that they're seeing within the platform. So data governance is a really key layer that we put a lot of stress on to make sure that the data governance, the data taxonomy is really in place and is maintained to make sure that the user adoption spreads through the company and that true data culture is adopted through the company.
So do you spend some time with a customer trying to understand what kind of the data do they need and how best to structure the data that they need?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's part of how we like to work with clients is exactly that, speaking to what your data currently looks like, what are the key questions that you as a business are looking to answer with a platform like this, and starting to then help define what the taxonomy should look like in order to be able to drive towards those business goals that you have as an organization. That's an important step to get to. No, don't get me wrong, you can always reshape things in future, but if you want to drive adoption, I can't stress this enough, is make sure that the data is understandable across the business, across multiple functions, and make sure it is in order so that actually you can drive useful output rather than just throwing a load of data into a visualization tool, which then can't actually drive an output which is going to obviously help the business.
Thank you. Last question that I've got. How long did it take to develop this product?
Good question. I wasn't directly involved in developing it myself. So we've been a business from around 2012. The core function started off with Amplitude Analytics. And that's evolved really. I think the initial stages was identifying that a lot of the platforms in the market at the time were more focused on web-based analytics. A lot of focus on marketing analytics as well, understanding how users got to the website. And we saw that actually there was a need to better understand user engagement at an event-based analytics level, understand user engagement within the platform. So instead, what we focused on was actually apps. Obviously, everyone knows how important mobile is as a platform, but the whole growth of apps over the years was where we really focused on initially, and then expanded out actually the event-based analytics model across the wider ecosystem. So not only focusing on apps, but then focusing on the wider digital product ecosystem. So in short answer, since 2012, but that's been evolving as the industry has shifted.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks very much.